We took off and everything was reasonably calm in Kabul. Obviously the city was still secure, or we thought so. And in the 3 hours that we transited up to Kabul, things had changed somewhat and the airfield was getting quite chaotic, so we had to hold off for a number of hours. There was a disabled aircraft on the runway and we finally landed after a couple of attempts because various vehicles had been driving across the runway. And the airfield by then was very busy, obviously, because several aircraft had been holding off, and we unloaded our troops and we took on freight for that first trip. And by the time we started engines and taxied out, the airfield came under attack on the south side. So there was quite a lot of stuff going on, as you can imagine.
Obviously, big mission priority was to get on the ground, and it was a sense of how are we going to get this aircraft on the ground safely. I was constantly in radio contact with the American controller on the ground about who had control of what, and it rapidly became apparent that no one had control of anything on the airfield at the time. With our worsening fuel situation, we decided to hold off a little bit longer, but it's still trying to sense if we got done. And actually, when we returned to base, there was almost a sense of guilt that we hadn't got down on onto the ground to bring any civilians out. But having seen the other media footage of the American C-17 on the ground at the time with people clambering all over it, and it turned out to be the right decision. We didn't want to put our aircraft in that harm's way, and ultimately we potentially could have lost the aircraft on the ground with it being damaged by everyone.
We got the passengers on, got them all secure in the back of the aircraft. We were in the cruise, and I noticed this family. It was mum, dad, 3 daughters and a son, and they were in a particularly bad way. You could see all of them were exhausted. The eldest daughter was quite clearly in shock. So we're trying to administer just basic first aid, a bit of water, a bit of food to try and bring her out of that state. So I've already got my eye on that family, making sure that they're going to be looked after for the next few hours. And then out the corner of my eye, I just see something drop onto the floor. And as I look over, bless her, this woman's picking up her 2-week-old child. Go over and try and strap the baby closer using seatbelts, anything I can just to make it easier for mum and baby. And within a couple of minutes, it happened again. And at that point, it was just the only thing I could think of to do was just plead with the family to let me take the baby for half an hour or however long they'd let me, just so she could have enough sleep to gain a little bit more energy to hold her baby. And you're holding a baby that weighs nothing, absolutely nothing. It's 2 weeks old, and you think how exhausted must this poor woman be to not be able to carry her own child. It's a basic instinct, and she just couldn't do it anymore. And it was an awful thing to see, but a privilege to be able to help.
We put the throttles up, went to go and take off, and we just spotted some vehicles which were coming in our kind of right 1 o'clock, heading down the parallel taxiway. So they weren't a threat at the time, but then they just turned right and went to go across the runway. And at this point we were about 95 knots, and they were about 1,000 feet ahead of us, and we realised that we wouldn't have been able to reject the takeoff, because if I tried to reject, then I would have basically cleaned up the bus and taken out the bus, and that doesn't really bear thinking about. So I had to continue the takeoff, and then only a few moments later, I realised I wasn't going to be able to achieve my takeoff speed, so rotate speed, and so I said, I think we're going to need to rotate early, and the other pilot said agreed, and we started to rotate the aircraft about 20 knots earlier than rotate speed. We got airborne and we just missed the bus by probably about 10-15 feet.